Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on the law and policy of herbicide spraying in New Brunswick. My name is Richelle Martin, and I'm a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law and am based in Fredericton in the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqey Nation. I'm also joined by a few colleagues. Tina Northrup is another staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law. Tina's based in Halifax and will also be presenting today. We also have Caroline Lubbe D'Arcy, who's the chair of Stop Spraying New Brunswick, who will be delivering a presentation today. And lastly, we have Marieka Chaplin, who's the director of freshwater and forest conservation at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, who will also be presenting today. So thank you everyone for joining. And we also want to thank the New Brunswick Law Foundation for the funding to support this webinar. So we wanted to begin with acknowledging the traditional territories that we're joining from today. So I'm joining the webinar, as I mentioned, from the territory of the Wolastoqey Nation, and I invite you to think about the territories that you're joining from today. The lands in New Brunswick are governed by the treaties of peace and friendship that the Wabanaki nations entered with the British in the 18th century. And these treaties did not deal with the cessation or surrender of lands, but were designed to govern respectful relationships between sovereign nations and their peoples. At East Coast Environmental Law, as a public interest environmental law charity, we really believe that upholding Indigenous rights and building relationships with Indigenous-led organizations is critical to building a more just, equitable, decolonized, and sustainable future for our region. And in today's webinar, we'll be talking about Crown land, but keeping in mind that Crown land in New Brunswick is unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous land. And just a little bit about who East Coast Environmental Law is, what we do. So we are a regional charity. We work in all 4 Atlantic provinces to provide public interest environmental law services. We envision a future where laws and legal systems protect ecological health and promote environmental and climate justice. And to get to this vision, we advocate for progressive environmental law and policy through participating in environmental law reform processes. We provide public legal education like this webinar today, and we share our legal skills to support others who are working to prevent or redress environmental harms. And I've shared a link to our website where you can find out more information. You can find resources on different topics, and you can access our environmental law inquiry service. So here's an overview of the webinar today. So as I said, we'll have a few different presentations. And then we'll have about 25 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So just to begin, I wanted to touch on the context for why we're covering this topic today. So why we're talking about the law and policy of herbicide spraying. So back in 2021, the Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick's Standing Committee on Climate Change and Environmental Stewardship published a really important report after there had been, at the time, broad public concern over the health and ecological impacts of widespread herbicide spraying in the province. And so the Standing Committee was put together to study this issue and heard from the public, Indigenous-led organizations, industry, and government departments, and then produced a report with a series of recommendations in 2021. And I've included a link to the report in the slide here. I won't go into details right now about what the recommendations were. Marieka will be covering that a little bit more in her presentation. But to say that this was an important sort of catalyst for action on this issue. The recommendations were mostly ignored until Premier Holt's renewed commitments in 2024 with a mandate letter that was issued to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to take the lead on two commitments. So one was to implement the recommendations of the standing committee, and the second was to investigate alternatives to pesticide and herbicide use and reevaluate the safety of glyphosate in New Brunswick. And so this has created a kind of a renewed attention from our government on this 2021 report and in looking at this issue. And over the past year, the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Environment and Local Government have been reporting to the standing committee on their progress to achieve these recommendations. We also have just some very recent changes in federal legislation that Tina will get into. So this is another part of the context. And there's broad concern still of the health and ecological impacts that widespread herbicide use has in New Brunswick and across Canada. And so I just included a screenshot here of a recent article from CBC about the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council receiving funding to look at the impacts that DDT and glyphosate may be having on moose in New Brunswick. So this will be new research that will be happening. So with all of these developments and a renewed commitment from the government to address concerns, it's a good time to continue encouraging decision makers to do just that, to address these concerns. And so our goal with the webinar today is to give you some information on the relevant legal frameworks, and then for our guests from Conservation Council of New Brunswick and Stop Spraying New Brunswick to provide information on their work and their campaigns on the issue. And so with that, I will turn it over to Caroline Lubbe D'Arcy to share some information on Stop Spraying New Brunswick's work. And so I'm going to stop my screen share, and then I'll let Caroline share her screen. Perfect. It looks good, Caroline. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Lubbe D'Arcy. I'm a dentist in Fredericton, and I'm chair of Stop Spraying New Brunswick. We are a registered non-charitable NGO run by volunteers, and we focus on one issue. Our goal is to see that the government of New Brunswick and NB Power stop using herbicides on public land. Because we engage completely in advocacy work, we are non-charitable, so we don't receive government funding, and we rely solely on donations from supporters and the bit of revenue that we make on the sale of our signs, car stickers, and front license plates. We are not an anti-pesticide group. We are campaigning against the use of herbicides in forestry because we are for forestry practices that encourage biodiversity and access to nature for New Brunswick residents. We are very concerned about the loss of biodiversity and access to nature due to current forest management practices, which is focused on converting diverse Acadian forests into softwood plantations that are managed with herbicides. Our campaign began in 2014 by two hunters who invited our vice chair, Don Bowser, and I to help them out. The highest percentage of the population lives in rural areas of New Brunswick, which is different from the rest of Canada. The reason why so many people in rural New Brunswick became mobilized on this issue of forest herbicide spraying is not because of health concerns, but because of the resultant loss of habitat, which leads to reduced wildlife numbers. It all started with a handwritten petition in 2015 because the government of New Brunswick does not recognize online petitions. We had collected around 35,000 signatures by 2017, which we tabled at the New Brunswick legislature. After reaching this milestone, we shifted our focus to targeting MLAs with letter-writing campaigns, meeting with politicians, issuing annual report cards to elected political parties, speaking at meetings, etc. We speak at hunting and fishing groups, and we also have an information booth at the annual Hunting and Fishing Trade Show, which is part of the Moncton Sportsman Show. And this is a huge event in New Brunswick, so we reach a lot of people just by being there. And we get lots of activity coming to our information table, so it's a really great place for us to be. We have an email list of a few hundred supporters, and we try to send out a few newsletters a day. Most of our outreach, though, is via our Facebook group, which is a public discussion group, which has over 19,500 members. We also have an Instagram account. New Brunswick is the home of the Acadian forest, which is one of the most diverse forest types in the world. And, New Brunswick is experiencing an accelerated loss of public old growth forests, which are being replaced by monoculture softwood plantations that are managed with herbicides to kill off other growth that interferes with the growth of softwood trees. This practice leads to a decline in habitat that many of the species need. At this time, 16% of the Crown Forest has been converted into softwood plantations. The goal is 20 to 25% in the next decade. And you can see this in the State of the Forest report, which was published by the government in November of 2023. The province has promised 30% protection, but really, in effect, it's only 21.5%, and I'll explain why. The numbers that they listed as conservation was 18.2% protected areas, 3.3% conservation habitat, and 8.5% watercourse and wetland buffers. But buffer strips are only 30 meters wide, and they're sandwiched between clear cuts plantations and waterways. So that's not really meaningful habitat. So we're definitely running short. Our campaign focuses on effects of the environment and our economy. Forestry on Crown land is heavily subsidized in New Brunswick, and the number of forestry jobs are declining. I would like to show you the officer of the Chief Medical Office of Health published a report in August of 2016, and in it they studied the pattern of glyphosate use in New Brunswick. And this pie chart is a kind of a helpful way to see what it's like here. And you'll see that forestry, in total is 61%. So 61% of all the glyphosate used in New Brunswick lands on our forests. Only 11% is used in agriculture. And then you've got 27% used by industry. So the focus of the plantations managed with herbicides has a serious effect on the available habitat for wildlife and birds. And this intensive forest management also affects access to nature for people. The spray season runs from late July to November. So people who have camps, foragers, hikers, fishers are all affected. An entire way of life is affected by the way forestry is done in this province. There have been enough research articles published now that is becoming more common knowledge that the forest trees communicate with each other via their roots and fungi that live alongside the root systems of trees. The presence of birch trees benefits softwood trees, so it would make more sense not to just plant softwood trees. More diversity would help wildlife. But of course, there's still the need of old forest, which is very important. So now, and also now it's understood that, monoculture plantations just don't make a healthy tree stand. Tightly planted trees and plantations do not allow light in, and darkness in a plantation discourages other growth. Forest indicator species are the canaries in the coal mine for forests, and we have 9 of them in New Brunswick. A decline a decline in forest habitat is already affecting a few of these species, namely the white-breasted nuthatch, the blackback woodpecker, and the American marten, which means that they don't have enough habitat to thrive at this point in time. Peer-reviewed research published in credible scientific journals has found the following, that the type of forest management in New Brunswick greatly affects, like in New Brunswick, greatly affects the normally very large and varied bird population that needs old growth. A study was done by a researcher who's from New Brunswick in 2021, and then he published another one a few years ago. And it clearly shows a really large decline in the songbird population. Also, glyphosate remains in the soil and is absorbed into wild plants such as wild berries. And glyphosate has been shown to interfere with the reproduction of wild plants and that have been studied so far. And the navigation potential of bees has been affected as well. So in general, we're seeing a general loss of biodiversity, food, and habits for birds is what is taking place. Stop Spraying New Brunswick has 2 GIS maps. We have a volunteer who does this for us. One of them is the historical spray map of New Brunswick since 1969. It syncs. It's basically an application. It's an ArcGIS app that we use. It's a free one that we have, so we don't pay for it. But basically, it's you can map. He's got deer wintering yards, drinking watersheds mapped on it, and then on top of that, you see all the places that have been sprayed over the years. And he's got some color coding, so you can see in what decade and stuff it happened. It syncs with government data, so we don't add any of our own to it. And every year, when the government releases data from the previous year's spraying, then that website automatically, that map automatically updates. Um, just like I'm just trying to get my slide. Yeah. So on average, 15,000 hectares of public forest is sprayed annually with herbicides. You can see this bar graph that reflects each year's number of hectares sprayed. And it varies a little bit, but the average is around 15,000. And this year, actually, actually last year, there was less spraying than normally happens. And that is because there were, forest fires a lot, and the forests were closed. So this year we're probably going to see an increase in spraying to make up for the shortfall last year. We have also seen incidences of multiple spray applications, not just the one application during the lifetime of a plantation, which is what the Pest Management Regulatory Agency assumes is the standard. In 2024, we released a report that showed, and after an analysis, how many cut blocks have been sprayed once, twice, three, four, five, six, 7 times. And you can see that there's a reasonably large number of plantations that have been sprayed 2 times, especially, and also some even more frequently. This is, of course, using data that not 2024 and 25 because we used up to 2023 to get this report done. The other GIS map that we have is the current spray licenses map. This map, again, updates every year when the government releases the current spray licenses. And we are able to keep these spray license map up for the whole year, but the government basically takes it down as soon as the spray season is over in November. But on our map, you can still see spray licenses, for the entire year until the next year's licenses are released. So that can help people when, when they've seen some activity somewhere and it looks like something was sprayed, and they go back to our map and actually see, did it have a license this year or was it another time? Um, Now, our volunteer is able to hang on to the information from the previous spray licenses, but the government, the information disappears. But thanks to our GIS volunteer, he has that information. And he also made a table that shows what licenses were issued this year. And you see Crown, private, and freehold. Normally, there are actually way more freehold licenses, but for some reason this year, DNR did not receive all the information from the companies. So Irving and Acadian Timber, we can't see what licenses they got. Now, our campaign is of course focused on public land and MB power spraying, but we always show all spray licenses. So we're still kind of curious what happened there. But anyway, so this is what we've got right now. So the economy and jobs. Well, forestry and crown land is heavily subsidized in New Brunswick, and the number of forestry jobs are declining. And I listed the subsidies on the slide that you can see. So it's quite a large subsidy in total that the companies get to operate on our crown land. And the jobs are declining. You can see an infographic from 2014 that was created in anticipation of the deal that the Alward government signed with JDI in 2014. It was already predicting less jobs than they were currently at the time in New Brunswick. And then you can compare it to Vermont, Ontario, New York State, who do forestry differently, more community forestry, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they have more of an auction system. So yeah, so they way more jobs there, per 100 cubic meters. Then if you look at the jobs, Statistics Canada lists 12,925 jobs in forestry, but the government of New Brunswick inflates those numbers greatly. And earlier this year, there was quite a big publicity event together with UPA Consultants, where the government of New Brunswick claimed, that there were 23,819 jobs in forestry. So I contacted DNR just to ask what the discrepancy was, and they explained that they were using the UPI numbers, and UPI includes estimated indirect and induced jobs. So I don't know what those jobs could be. It could be people that work at Tim Hortons or places where people get lunch who work in forestry. I'm not sure. So Richelle already mentioned, that there's some good news because wildlife studies in New Brunswick are wildly needed, like much needed. At this point, the government only studies biological diseases such as chronic wasting disease and tests for the presence of heavy metals, but we need other kinds of studies. So now finally, there's going to be a study on the livers of moose, and they're focusing right now on zone 7 and 8 because they only have so much money, and testing livers for residues of DDT and glyphosate is very expensive. Um, so here's a list of our activities. I already kind of mentioned those in the beginning, but I just thought I'd give a little timeline of how we did it. We started with the petition campaign the first couple of years, which is a great way to raise awareness about an issue. It gives you something to talk to people about. And we had so many volunteers, like people that I never even met, that saw our petition on our website and on our Facebook group, and they just went on their own to get signatures. So that's how the signatures happened. It was not really us that were talking to all these people to make it happen. It was very, how do you call it, like grassroots, which was pretty amazing to see. And so, yeah, so we had the 35 signatures by 2017. And then we decided to shift our focus to the government. So now we're more focused on approaching MLAs, the government. We give an annual report card to the government of New Brunswick, the political parties that are sitting in government on their performance on our issue. And we also register as a third party during elections. And then we have billboard signs and pledges that we can do. So we get candidates to sign pledges. This was the first election in 2024 where we had a few liberals, so major party candidates actually promised that they would try to work on this issue. So that was a big breakthrough for us. And CCNB helped us out with the billboards. So they helped us pay for some of our billboards, which was really, really helpful. And we spoke to the standing committee as well, the one that Richelle Martin referred to. I just thought I'd highlight quickly the government basically did not really implement the exactly what was asked for. Say for setbacks from dwellings, instead of a kilometer that was asked for in the report, they only gave 500. And now the spray, when aerial spraying is happening, the distance has to be 65 meters, but the committee asked for 100. And then MB power spraying has not stopped. The committee, I'm almost done, sorry, but DNR claimed, that it has stopped, but it hasn't. They've just stopped using glyphosates. So, there's still they switched to other herbicides. So, basically, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And I do end it with a slide of references that we like to refer people to if they want to read more.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing the information about your work and campaigns. So we'll move right on now to Tina Northrup's presentation on the federal regulation of pesticides. Okay, looks great, Tina.
Right. Thanks very much, Richelle, and apologies, it seems to have skipped ahead by a couple of slides before I was ready for it. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being with us here today in this webinar. So as Richelle has noted, my presentation is going to provide just an overview of federal regulation of pesticides in Canada, and then later when Richelle presents, she'll talk about provincial regulation of pesticides in New Brunswick in particular. So federally in Canada, regulation of pesticides is governed by the Pest Control Products Act. And so I'll be talking a lot about that act in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Excuse me. There are a few key points I'd like to highlight at the outset of this presentation. And the first is that the Pest Control Products Act and the regulations under the Act are separate and distinct from other federal environmental laws. And in particular, they're separate from the laws under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, 1999, which deal with the regulation of toxic substances. And so, although it might be easy to imagine that pesticides would be regulated in the same way as toxic substances federally, they're actually governed under two separate regimes. And the Pest Control Products Act regime is administered by Canada's Minister of Health through Health Canada. And in particular, it's administered through a branch of Health Canada called the Pesticides Regulatory Directorate. You might know that branch as the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. That was its name for many years. Recently, this year, that name was changed to the Pesticides Regulatory Directorate. So you'll see that terminology used in current and future publications on the work of the Directorate. So the Pest Control Products Act federally is really the gatekeeper for all regulated pesticides in Canada. And so although provinces like New Brunswick have considerable authority to restrict or prohibit the use of pesticides within their borders, within their jurisdiction, ultimately they can't approve the use of pesticides that have not been approved federally. And so the Pest Control Products Act regime federally is the regime that nationally decides whether or not a pesticide can be used within the country, and then provinces have additional authority to regulate use. Under the Pest Control Products Act, there's a mandate section that expresses a number of objectives that apply to the Minister of Health's work under the Act. There's a primary objective, which is to prevent unacceptable risks to individuals and the environment from the use of pest control products. There are also ancillary objectives, so sort of related secondary objectives, you might say. And I won't read through all of the information on this slide. I'll simply highlight a few key phrases that are in here. Some of the ancillary objectives relate to supporting sustainable development. And there's an intergenerational equity aspect of sustainable development as it's articulated in the Act. It talks about the needs of the present being met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. There's an objective of minimizing environmental and health risks posed by pest control products, encouraging public awareness in relation to pest control products, and also ensuring that only pest control products that are determined to have acceptable value are approved for use in Canada. So there's a cost-benefit analysis, you might say, that takes place under the Act when the Minister of Health is thinking about whether a pest control product poses a risk and what the value of using that product might be in comparison. Now, just recently, towards the end of June last month, there were some amendments to the Pest Control Products Act, which I'll be talking a little bit about during my presentation, and which Richelle flagged earlier. One of the amendments is that there's a new provision that expands the mandate section of the Act a little bit and expands the minister's responsibility under Section 4 of the Act in particular. So you can see the new language here, and it says, for the purposes of this Act, the minister is to consider as appropriate national economic security, regional economic security, or national food security. And there's a caveat to that new responsibility to consider those factors, which is that this subsection does not affect the primary objective, which I mentioned earlier. And so the primary objective of the Act, and I'll just scroll back temporarily, again, is to prevent unacceptable risks to individuals and the environment from the use of pest control products. And so this new language introduces new requirements to consider economic security and national food security, national economic security and regional economic security, as well as national food security. But these considerations can't override the primary objective of the Act. There's also in the mandate section, again, this intergenerational equity language coming out. And so we see a clear statement that protection and consideration afforded to children in the Act shall also extend to future generations. Now, federal regulation of pesticides has a number of nuances, and I won't cover them today. This overview is really a high-level summary of some of the key aspects of the Act. But really, the Act hinges on the concept of acceptable risk versus unacceptable risk. So you've talked a little bit about the primary objective under the Act already, which is to prevent unacceptable risks to individuals and the environment from the use of pest control products. And so that begs the question, well, then what is an unacceptable risk versus unacceptable risk? The Act defines the phrase acceptable risk as referring to health or environmental risks of a pest control product that are acceptable if there's reasonable certainty that no harm to human health, future generations, or the environment will result from exposure to or use of the product, taking into account its conditions or proposed conditions of registration. So that's what constitutes an acceptable risk. And it therefore follows that an unacceptable risk would be a risk that exceeds the thresholds described here. So for the Minister of Health and the Pesticides Regulatory Directorate, their work administering the Act is really a process of evaluating and periodically re-evaluating the health and environmental risks of pesticides that are submitted for registration under the Act and approved for use in Canada. Now, there are various evaluation processes set out under the Act. Some are mandatory and some are discretionary. And I have some contents here that are taken directly from the Health Canada website describing key evaluation moments. So when a new pesticide is submitted for registration under the Act, there's an evaluation that happens that looks scientifically at the potential environmental and human health risks of the pesticide. Evaluations also happen when there's a proposed change, the way a pesticide is used, so an amendment to its registration. Evaluations happen in relation to imports as well. And there are requirements to periodically re-evaluate registered pest control products every 15 years. There are also discretionary powers to initiate re-evaluations outside of that 15-year cycle. There are a number of key evaluation provisions in the Act, which I won't cover in detail here. Suffice it to say that Section 7 of the Act deals with registration for the first time and with amendments, or with applications rather, to amend product registrations. Section 16 deals with that 15-year mandatory reevaluation period and also gives the Minister of Health a discretionary power to require reevaluations outside of that 15-year period, so within fewer than 15 years if certain conditions are met. And Section 17 covers a number of things, but among those other things, enables members of the public to request special reviews by the minister. So if new information or evidence emerges about a registered pest control product and an organization or individual members of the public would like to draw that information to the minister's attention and have a special review done of an existing product registration, there's a mechanism to apply for that. The Act also sets out what evaluations require from the perspective of the science and the considerations that need to be brought to bear when product registrations or amendments to registrations are requested. So there are a number of factors set out. The requirement is for a scientifically based approach. There are provisions that deal with health risk factors, with aggregation, like aggregate exposure, cumulative effects, threshold effects, appropriate margins of safety for various demographics, and a number of other things. Ultimately, it is the applicant, so the person, sometimes called the proponent, who is requesting registration or an amendment to a registration to prove that there are acceptable risks versus unacceptable risks. Now, as we've noted, there were some recent changes to the Act that have introduced some pretty significant differences, and those changes have caused concern among a number of organizations and public interest groups. And those changes essentially create certain new cabinet override powers. And so when I refer to the cabinet, I mean the federal government executive. And so this would be the body comprised of the Prime Minister and the ministers of the federal government. So under the Pest Control Products Act, as it exists now and as it previously existed, the Minister of Health has power to deny applications to register pest control products and also has the power to deny applications to amend existing registrations. And the minister can deny those applications when they do not consider that the health or environmental risks of a product would be acceptable. Now, through the new amendments that were brought in last month, the governor and council has the power to override ministerial denials and essentially to say that a pest control product can be used. And there are two new orders that the governor and council or the cabinet can issue in this regard. There's an emergency order, which deals with situations where the governor and council or the cabinet decides that there's a need for emergency control of a seriously detrimental infestation, and the order is necessary to protect national economic security, regional economic security, and national food security or national food security. And then there are also economic security and food security orders, and these powers are arguably much broader. As compared to the emergency control powers, they're not designed to deal specifically with emergency situations that deal with seriously detrimental infestations. Instead, they're designed on paper to be used in theoretically many, perhaps any situation where the cabinet sees a need to protect national economic security, regional economic security, or national food security. And so because these changes are so new, it is too early to tell at this point exactly what the pattern of use is going to be. We may also see legal challenges arising from their use, but all of that is still to be seen at this point. Just with an eye on time and recognizing that my time is coming to a close, I'm not going to spend much time on incident reporting, except to say that the Pest Control Products Act regime includes an incident reporting mechanism that members of the public can use when interaction with pest control products causes harm, either to human health or to the environment. And there are also a number of key opportunities for public consultation and input under the Act. And so there, as I've mentioned, are opportunities for members of the public to request special reviews of registered pest control products. There are the incident reporting mechanisms, and there are also statutory requirements for public consultation when proponents apply to register a pest control product or to amend a registration. And likewise, there are requirements for public consultation during reevaluations and special reviews. So there are mechanisms built into the regime that are intended to allow public input and public opportunities to voice concerns. I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have during the discussion period.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. Really helpful overview and update on the recent changes. So I'm going to get right into my presentation. So I'll share my screen again. Just give me one moment to get things set up. Okay. Is my screen looking good? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So my presentation is going to be really brief. So I'll also provide just a high-level overview of how the province regulates pesticides and provincial jurisdiction over pesticide regulation, some licensing and permitting requirements under New Brunswick's Pest Control Product Act. I'll go over some of the permit conditions that relate to aerial application of pesticides, and then the role of the Pesticides Advisory Board and opportunities for the public to voice concerns to that board. And just a brief note before I move on, just with language, pesticides, I'll just clarify that when we say herbicides, it's a category of pesticides. So pesticide also covers herbicides, including glyphosate. So as we learned from Tina, the federal government is responsible for the approval and registration of pesticides for use in Canada, including herbicides like glyphosate. So the only pesticides that can be used in New Brunswick are those that have been registered by the Federal Pesticides Regulatory Directorate. the government of New Brunswick does have the authority to further restrict pesticide use in New Brunswick and can prohibit the use of pesticides that the Pesticides Regulatory Directorate permits. And so the laws of New Brunswick can put in place stricter rules on how pesticides are used, but they can't be weaker than the federal government. So the province of New Brunswick does provide further restriction on pesticides through its Pesticides Control Act and the regulations under it. The Act and its regulations regulate the storage, sale, use, and disposal of non-domestic pesticides in New Brunswick. Currently, there's one regulation called the General Regulation under the Act that provides more details on licensing, certificate, and permit requirements for pesticide use. And like the federal government's regulation of pesticides, the provincial government regulates pesticide use separately from its Clean Environment Act, Clean Water Act, and Clean Air Act. These are referred to as the Clean Acts, all regulate environmental pollution and development, but pesticides have their own framework. The Pesticides Control Act is administered in New Brunswick by the Department of Environment and Local Government, and key decision makers within the framework are the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, the Director of Pesticides Control, the Pesticides Advisory Board, and inspectors. And it's important to note that the Act applies to individuals, corporations, and the Crown. So this means that the legal requirements apply to pesticide applications on Crown land as well as private land. So the Act sets out a series of licenses, certificates, and permits that are required for the storage, sale, supply, handling, and then application of non-domestic pesticides in the province. So I have a little description of each listed, but today's presentation, I'll just be focusing on pesticide use permits. And there are various classes of permits that are based on the type of pesticide and the method of application. And under the legal framework, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change has the power to impose terms and conditions on pesticide use permits that are above and beyond what we see in the Act and regulations. And it's the minister who has the authority to issue the permits. And so the Act requires that non-domestic pesticides, including glyphosate, be used according to the product label, which is issued at the federal level, the Act and regulations, and then the terms and conditions that are in the permit. And the product label is approved by the Pesticides Regulatory Directorate. And so any requirements on the label have to be followed. The Act, as I said, can create additional restriction, and it does, and along with the terms and conditions, but they can't be weaker than the label requirements. And also worth noting that the pesticide permits are pesticide specific and site specific. So the permits that are issued will state which pesticides can be applied and where they can be applied. And so through the renewed focus on the 2021 Standing Committee report, the Pesticides Advisory Board was put together, and one thing that they did was looked at the pesticide use permit for the aerial application of herbicides in New Brunswick and revised some of the conditions. As Caroline mentioned in her presentation, they didn't follow all of the recommendations, but there were changes that were made. And so I got a copy of the template of the permit that is used for aerial applications, and I'll just go through, again, I don't have a lot of time, I'll go through some of the key conditions that deal with public health and environmental protection. And I've also noted in the slides, and we can share the slides afterwards with those who registered, so you have all of the information that are there. But I've noted which requirements are permit conditions and which are from the Act and regulations. And I've done that because the permit conditions are easier to have amended than the requirements that are in the Act and the regulations. So there are public notice requirements before an aerial spray happens. So 2 weeks before the spraying starts, the Department of Environment has to approve a notice that's circulated in the local newspaper and potentially other places approved by the department. And it has to have certain information in it, like when the spraying's happening, where it's happening, what product will be used, health information, and who to contact for more information. There's also requirements to post the actual area and access points 24 hours before the spraying starts, and a new requirement to notify the residents that are within 1 kilometer of the treatment site before the spraying starts. And then while the spraying is happening, all of the access points to the treatment area have to be controlled. And so setbacks is another area that that has had a lot of public discussion and concern. And so there's some permit conditions that deal with setbacks. And when I say setbacks, I mean the distance that has to be maintained during the aerial spraying from certain features. And so under the permit conditions right now, there's a requirement to spray 500 meters away from occupied homes or camps, 65 meters from surface water, 50 meters from adjacent property boundaries, and then 30 meters outside of designated watershed protected areas. These are areas that are designated for protection for because they provide a public drinking water source. The standing committee's recommendation was also to increase the setback for homes to 1 kilometer, which we haven't seen that happen, and 100 meters for protected natural areas, which we also haven't seen implemented yet. There's also requirements relating to wind speeds, maximum wind speeds during application and recording wind speeds. And then again, I'm not going to get into all of the details of the conditions that relate to spills and what happens if there's an accident. But there are requirements if certain quantities of pesticides are spilled, there's a requirement to notify an emergency center, the regional emergency center, to take measures that the director might require, and to document what was done about it. There's also record-keeping requirements. So the department, as Caroline mentioned, they have information on the total quantity of pesticide used through the year and where the pesticides were applied. So that information is made public. And briefly on the enforcement of these laws and conditions, the minister does have the ability to revoke permits if the minister believes that the conditions haven't been followed. There's also inspectors that are appointed under the Act that have authority to issue orders under the Act. So they can order somebody to stop using a pesticide if they believe that the person has violated the Act regulations or the terms and conditions of their permit, or if they believe that the application is dangerous to the health of a person, animal, soil, crops, or plant life. And then the Act also establishes offenses and penalties for violating the Act regulations or terms and conditions of these permits. And so I'm just going to end with a little bit of information on the role of the Pesticides Advisory Board, because this board is an opportunity to have concerns heard and brought to the minister relating to the pesticide use in the province. And so the Act requires that a board be established, and there is one established now. And their role is to review the content and operation of the Act and regulations, and they can recommend changes to the minister. I've also included in bold here that the Act also requires that the board meet at least once per year to hear from interested persons with respect to any matter concerning pesticides. And so there's a requirement to notify the public when this meeting is happening. But it would be possible to reach out to the chair of the board. I've included the name on the next slide, to say that you're interested in raising a concern with the board and to ask them when their next meeting will be, or to let you know when the next meeting is happening. They do publish very like general annual reports as well at a high level that detail their activities. And this is my last slide. This is a list as of the end of March 2024. This is the latest annual report that I could find. This lists the members of the board. And so Danny Stymist is the Director of Pesticides Control, who would be the chair of the board. There's also members from the Department of Environment, Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture and Fisheries, Department of Health, WorkSafe New Brunswick, and Natural Resources. So that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions during the question period if there's others. And so I will stop my screen share. And lastly, our last presentation will be from Marieka Chaplin on the work of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And you can see my screen?
Yes. If you put it in presenter view, then we'll see it in the full screen. Okay. Yep.
There we go.
There we go. Yep, that looks good.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Had to click a few buttons there. My name is Marieka Chaplin, and I am the Freshwater and Forest Conservation Director here at CCNB. And just listening to all the presentations is very interesting, of course. And I felt like I should say a little bit about my personal life in that I do have a history with trees. My husband and I had an orchard in New Brunswick in Keswick Bridge for 13 years, and we chose to certify it organic. So for, I think, 6 years that we operated, it was certified organic. And then at a certain point, we had established our credentials, I guess, in the community, and we didn't continue the certification. But certainly there are alternatives to how we steward the land, and that was a choice that we made. And it was an honor, really, to have so many customers come to our UPIC that were seeking out food that was pesticide-free. So anyway, a little bit more about the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. We are an environmental nonprofit. We've been operating since 1969. I myself have been here a little over a year. We are membership-based. And in 2024, the board and the staff and members undertook a strategic planning exercise with a new vision, which is a healthy, sustainable, just environment in New Brunswick for all. And our new mission, which is the Conservation Council of New Brunswick promotes and advocates for a healthy, shared environment through research, education, and engagement with communities, industry, and government. We have a great staff team, some of whom are pictured here on this slide. Our executive director is Bev Gingras. Matt Abbott is the Marine Program Director. Dr. Mo Qureshi is the Director of Climate Research and Policy. Danielle Smith is the Director of Education and Engagement. Caitlin Plant is the Director of Communications and Marketing. And I've already introduced myself. Dr. Mo Qureshi and Danielle Smith both have larger teams with amazing staff people as well. So further to the strategic planning process, members and supporters' top concerns identified in 2024 are climate change, sustainable forest management, herbicide and pesticide use, biodiversity loss, and lack of renewable energy or reliance on fossil fuels. I'm sure as we've seen things develop here in our province, that list has probably grown this year, but this is what our strategic plan is founded on. Some history of the glyphosate. The topic of glyphosate in 1970 to 2000 was early advocacy and awareness. 2000 to 2011, there are public petitions opposing spraying, gaining momentum. In 2015, WHO, the World Health Organization, declares glyphosate a probable carcinogen. In 2016, there's the largest petition in New Brunswick history presented to the Legislative Assembly. In 2017, CCNB starts publishing annual spray hotspot maps and online letter rating campaign, which the letter rating campaign is still active on our website today. And in 2021 were the provincial legislative hearings, which we participated in. In 2023 was Health Canada's controversial decision about Mad Dog Plus, and 2024 an ongoing, that's sort of the focus of my presentation. I have some slides to show you. and our activities on this topic. So my role includes glyphosate, but I have a range of other files that I follow. You can find out more information on our website, conservationcouncil.ca. We attend meetings and workshops. We conduct media interviews upon request on the topic. We also write letters and have meetings with ministers. We have our glyphosate spraying hotspots information, the online letter writing campaign, and we collaborate with others, including East Coast Environmental Law and Stop Spraying New Brunswick. I'm proud to be showing you this slide. We also launched an ecological forestry webinar, Lunch and Learns, on some fascinating topics with some excellent presenters. Will be continuing this in the fall. We had Dr. Matthew Betts, Dr. Tom Beckley, Dr. Cindy Prescott, and Dr. Anthony Taylor. And we had so much attendance at these events. It really brought home how much people care about our forests. And that was wonderful to see. We do have them available on our YouTube page, and I'll put that link in the chat as well for those that would like to see the recordings. All three, Dr. Matt Betts' presentation wasn't recorded, but the other three are, and I encourage you to take a listen. There are alternatives to spraying. That's something that is important to note. Similar to having our orchard in Keswick Ridge, we found there were alternatives. So there's mechanical vegetation control, as seen in British Columbia and Sweden, which uses machines or manual labor to cut mulch or uproot competing vegetation. There's prescribed or controlled burning in Alberta and Oregon are some examples, which is intentional controlled fire to reduce competing vegetation and prepare site for regeneration. In Finland, there's mulching and ground cover techniques, applying mulch or planting cover crops to suppress unwanted vegetation and retain soil moisture. There are more alternatives. There's targeted grazing. In BC and Sweden, we see that with the use of livestock like goats or sheep to graze on competing vegetation. Manual weeding and tending in Quebec and Germany, which involves hand pulling or cutting of competing vegetation around seedlings. And in Ontario, Quebec, and Scandinavia, there's silvicultural planning and species selection. So designing forest stands using natural regeneration techniques, planting taller seedlings, shade-tolerant species, or mixed species planting. There's also a very interesting herbicide alternatives program in northeastern Ontario. There's a whole website with great information on there, which involves the sharing of Indigenous knowledge to develop new approaches from forest management through free to grow. This takes place in Chaplin Green, Crown Game, Gordon Costin's Romeo Mayette and Martel Forests, and with support from Natural Resources Canada. Our recommendations for 2021 for the Select Committee were to scale back clear cutting, stop paying for spraying, having much wider buffer zones around water and wetlands. We recommended phasing out herbicide use in forestry crown lands, moving towards ecological forestry, and reforming the Crown Lands and Forest Act itself. Current status, it's a little bit of repetitive for what Richelle said, especially at the top section, but with the Liberal government here in our province, Premier Susan Holt did mandate Minister Gilles Lepage to implement recommendations because there was quite a lot of public support for this in the lead up to the election. And last year, on June the 11th, 2025, the same committee heard from government staff tasked with implementing all 20 recommendations. And this recorded update can be viewed on the Legislative Assembly webcast. You just need to look up the date. And many recommendations do await full implementation. Some examples of recommendations that we wanted to bring to your attention were recommendation number 8, that remaining old hardwood, mixed wood, and softwood be maintained, not converted. That would require ecologically based forestry as well as additional national protected areas. One of the questions we had about that is, why is this being delayed until the end of 2027, which is already 3 years into the mandate of the Liberal government. And additionally, what examples of ecologically based forestry are being employed? We'd love to see more. Recommendation 20, that within 6 months of the tabling of this report, DNR create a public dashboard regarding all aspects of Crown Forest utilization, including pesticide spraying, for the purpose of increasing public education and awareness. The launch of this dashboard was expected in the spring of 2026, and we haven't seen anything yet. With the widespread public opposition to glyphosate use, it should get the attention and prioritization it deserves from Minister Lepage and Minister Heron. In 2025, with the new ministers, we developed briefing notes for them. Glyphosate was one of them. Our notes included a moratorium on glyphosate use, a complete comprehensive research on environmental, health, and economic impacts, phase reduction, and a transition plan to rapidly phase out glyphosate use in forestry, establishing clear timelines and benchmarks for adopting sustainable and ecologically friendly alternatives, and collaboration with Indigenous communities to co-design forest management practices with Indigenous governments and communities, incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and prioritizing biodiversity. So in the news recently, we wanted to pick a few stories that are important to share. So in December of last year was the landmark glyphosate study retracted for Monsanto ghostwriting and other ethics problems. It's a study that regulators around the world relied on for decades to justify continued approval of glyphosate, and it was quietly retracted over serious ethical issues, including secret authorship by Monsanto employees, raising questions about the pesticide approval process in the US and globally. From June of this year, Tina mentioned some of this. This is my quick overview. The Carney government passes the law allowing authorization of banned pesticides. CBC reported the federal government has brought in major changes to how pesticides are regulated in Canada, granted Cabinet the power to authorize their use, and even pesticides Health Canada has deemed are unsafe. Also in June of this year, from the Weather Network, scientists discover a surprising link between common weed killer and superbugs. Researchers have found evidence that glyphosate, Canada's most widely used herbicide, may help select for bacteria that are resistant to multiple antibiotics. The spread of antimicrobial resistance, a phenomenon that occurs when bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites change so they no longer respond to medicine, could be fueled in part by a popular weed killer. And from July of this year, this month, in fact, the US Supreme Court decided that Roundup maker Bayer is not responsible for providing a cancer warning label on the product. People who claim the popular weed killer Roundup caused their cancer will now have a harder time suing the manufacturer after a recent US Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court decided that Bayer is not responsible for providing a cancer warning label on the product. That's because the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates US labels, has not found the herbicide to be cancerous. Well, that's a lot. Rest assured, we're working active on this file. We continue to recommend a ban and provide alternatives. We do continue to hold the government to account and to work collaboratively to share the message. We do believe in a healthy, sustainable, just environment in New Brunswick for all, and we offer a couple opportunities for you to help. You could stay informed. We have a monthly Eco News newsletter that you can see in the first QR code. You can become a member. That's in the second QR code, third QR code. We love donors and we are a registered charity, so you can get a charitable tax receipt. And last but not least, become an advocate. We have our Stop Spraying of New Brunswick letter available for signing on the website. And what holds even more importance, I mean, definitely send your letter in, but also if you can write a personal letter to the ministers, that makes ministers and the premier, that makes it an impact as well. Please do include a letter to your local MLA as well. And I think that's it for me. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marieka, for your presentation. It's great to hear about the great work that Conservation Council of New Brunswick is doing on this topic. And so that ends our presentations.